to see if anybody else is trickling in. My name is Peter Gray, and I'm with Washington Area Bicyclists Association. I am also the co-chair of Montgomery County Families for Safe Streets, and do work with Mike gladly on some regional collaboration efforts. Well, I don't see anybody else coming in, so I will turn it over to Mike and Andrew and Trisalyn. So
great.
Hi guys.
Thank you very much, Peter. So yeah, I'll kick us off, introduce us all, and then you're going to hear from myself a little bit of an overview of what you can actually do and using open data from governments and a bunch of tools the government provides. And they're going to see some examples from Mike in terms of what he's done with it. And Trisalyn has a lot of expertise in this area about how to use spatial data for advocacy, crowdsourcing, and some other great research that she's done. So it should be an exciting hour. We're going to cover an overview of some of these concepts and examples, and then we'll also be open for any questions or topics or anything that this group here wants to discuss. So with that, a little bit about myself as I dive in here is that I live in DC. I live in Capitol Hill, but we bike all around the city. I bike my kids to school. It's an amazing place to be. Mobile through different transit mechanisms, and that's really amazing. And this is, as you might recognize, this is along the mall where the road was closed one day, and my kids were definitely enjoying it. It's where they've learned to bicycle and ride. But the reality is, many people know in cities all around the world, and this region in particular, is that it's not always this ideal. The road's not always closed, right? It too often looks like this. And this is just a photo on one average day commuting back for my kids, dropping them off at school. And if you can believe it, this is actually a bike lane right here in between the divots and the paint and the cars and things like that. And this is something the city, like DC and counties and nearby us, are doing better. And since I took this photo, this has been fixed, but it definitely took a lot of advocacy. It took 311 requests. It took following up with when they were closed and getting things painted and patched and so on. And that's an example of just what we all want to do together, is be partners with our communities and improving them. So I also have the fortune of working for a company called Esri. And you might not have heard of Esri, but if you've ever looked at a map, we're probably behind the scenes. We've been around for about 50 some years, started and run by Jack and Laura Dangerman, and it is a very large company that works across the world, but we work closely in communities like DC, Wichita, Boston, Portland, Paris, all over the world, helping build tools to make sense of data in the world around us. And we believe that communities are better when they work together, that it isn't just one organization's responsibility to make all the data or all the decisions. Different people have different responsibilities. And what we want to do is be able to collaborate together, utilizing the data and the tools to make informed, better decisions. And what we've seen overall is that often what happens when organizations try and engage with the community is that there's a desired engagement, but the reality is there might be a lack of trust. And that lack of trust might come from limited engagement. On some of the panels earlier today, you heard about, it used to be a tradition to where you'd have these community meetings in the basement of the library on Tuesday at 6 p.m. And not everyone can make those meetings. And when they do, they're maybe bringing a certain perspective and voice and maybe even just feelings from their day. It's gotten better, but it's not perfect, right? There are multiple stakeholders. There are many levels of government. There are residents, there are tourists, there are apartment renters and so on that want to work together and have different perspectives. And really what it might boil down to or feel like is a conflict of vision. Should we put more bike lanes in? Should we narrow our roads? Should we make buses more frequent? These are questions that really we need to decide on. It might be hard to have that shared vision. So what we've seen as a practice and a pattern here is we want to have first a shared vision. Here's the plans. And I'll highlight definitely a few examples where at least DC specifically and a few the other regions are really doing this. They're sharing not just some announcement like Vision Zero, they're actually being very clear behind the scenes on it's not going well. And here's what we're going to do to improve it and what we need partnership with you. So they engage meaningfully. They're going to make these changes and want your feedback so they can make the right decisions. They can change specific intersections. They can change specific curb cuts or bulb outs and things like that with the community in mind, as they're also making it equitable and accessible for everybody. Ultimately, to finally build trust is to see these feedback loops constantly reinforced by having people engage these ways. But it's also interesting to think again in geography is what does it mean for me specifically? A city or a county and a state have to think about the entirety of the city, the state and the city. They think about how the whole system comes together. They think about how the roads have to connect together with the pipelines, with the buildings, with the infrastructure, and so on. And you can imagine the city changes frequently. They change obviously over years and decades as the nature of technology changes, as demographics change, as climate changes, but also every single day they change. DC used to double in population every day from the residents to who was in the town because of commuters and tourists and workers and so on. And so that's a very dynamic system. And then ultimately we care most about the street we live on. We care about where we live, where we have our children, or where we choose to have our pups and live our lives. And it's this interesting perspective that we have to help the city work better as a system by helping monitor and know what goes on in those streets to give feedback and give insight. And there's some really interesting research out there. This is a research report by Pew in 2015 in which they asked residents all around the country about how often are you trying to find data about your city. 65% said they want data about their city. Now that might be what school district they're in or what police district they're in. They want to know when the road's gonna be closed or where to go and get my parking permit, things like that. But when they interviewed these people at the time, less than 10% said they were very effective at doing that. So that's a dramatic gap in where residents and constituents want to find data and how hard it has been to find it. Fortunately, there's a lot of great practices that have emerged. There's a simple one that's easy to remember is called FAIR, that data and information about our communities and our government should be findable. So I don't have to go and to ask the right person down the hallway. I can just find it on the web or through government sites and portals. It's accessible, that I can easily use it in different formats. It doesn't require me to use one tool or one format or pay money for it. It's interoperable, so it can work in different tools I'm familiar with, and it's reusable. It's not restricted on reuse or what I can do with it. And that's been a change over the last 15, 20 years with data, where it used to be cost recovery and governments had to charge for their data sets via CD-ROM and DVDs and things like that. And that's really mostly gone away, which has been really amazing. So one tool that I work on that I'm going to talk about that everyone here can use is called ArcGIS Hub. This is a bunch of different suite of tools. I'll talk a little bit about them, and then you're going to hear from Mike and what he's done with some of these tools. It first lets governments and organizations share out an authoritative site. They can then share out open data, and there's a whole suite of engagement tools to use. And what's really, really cool is that anybody can sign up and get a free account and then use some of the tools I'm going to show you. You can start creating your own surveys, create your own dashboards, do your own analysis with either open data or your own data. So it's kind of a public digital infrastructure that you can use. And what's cool here and really amazing is we're seeing these hubs launch all around the world. There's about 30,000 of them all around the world, which is great because just the data are more accessible. We're closing that gap between 10% and 65%, but it also has the opportunity to have shared learning. It's the ability for us to see and compare data sets and say crashes or roads across municipalities in our region, across the country, with cities that are comparable to ours in other countries. And then even the analyses, the tools, the policies, we can actually start learning from each other. Much like open source code has changed how we build software, open data and shared digital collaboration can actually change how we affect and design and build our cities. So if nothing else here, you can go and find a hub near you. If you just go to hubarcgis.com, you can go and search for hubs in Maryland and Virginia, DC. If you're anywhere in the world, you can find them as well. We are working on a few interplanetary ones with NASA as well. So maybe one day you'll be able to download some great open data on the moon or Mars and things like that. But right now, you can mostly find things for local municipalities, federal governments, agencies, and so on. So go check it out. And there's a lot of transit ones, and that's what I'm going to focus on here for our discussion today. But there's other really cool ones, like Maryland just launched a 5 million trees initiative that you can go and search and check out their hub site and download data and engage and volunteer and contribute as well. So there's a lot of interesting things for you to engage, that your governments are getting better about opening up and creating better engagement for better trust. So I'm going to dive into DC because that's the city I live in. And DC is doing an amazing job of sharing out not just open data that I'll dive into in a second, but the Move DC program is actually here a hub. So it's built in to have open data and all these tools here. Adopt a Block, DDOT Bus Priority Projects, the DDOT Capital Projects, the Vision Zero program and site. All of these are actually powered by the same tools and technology that you can use and reuse as well. And again, you can create a free account here to go and engage on geospatial discussions, as well as build surveys and dashboards as also. So there's a lot of things here. And what's great about this is because it's all data driven, because maps and geography are infused in it, everything's spatial, which is a really, really important way for each of us to look at our neighborhoods and our blocks and how we move through the city and the communities and how we can give feedback there. So you can actually go and look at DC's Vision Zero crash analysis, dive in and find the projects near you, whether it's Georgia Avenue or Maryland Avenue, or different parks that are being updated. You can go and find them near you and engage on those and find out what's going on and scrutinize those, give feedback on those, advocate for things using the same data that the city's using. And DC in particular, and this is a model for a lot of cities, but we want to recognize it for what it is, has an amazing data policy. They make sure that all of their data are clearly defined as just default level 0, open. Level 1 is public, but they just haven't shared it yet. So submit FOIA requests. It's great. They're saying we can't get to all the data right away, but if there's a data set that isn't sensitive and you want it, submit through DC and other municipalities a FOIA request, and DC will usually publish that actually out to their open data hub so that anybody else can find it as well afterwards. Then they have other levels here for more sensitive data. So that should make us all feel really good as residents, is that DC has a very strict guidelines for what it won't share as open data, right? Not all government data can be shareable because it might be very sensitive information. So they're very careful about that. But with open data, it's very easy to use. And what's really cool is within a few seconds, you can go to opendatadc.gov and you can find data like the crash data or the bike lane data or the road closure data. And then with a few clicks, you can either highlight, and in this case, I bike around Stanton Park. That's where that photo was taken from. I can highlight that there's no bike lane here, and I can go into my local ANC now and say, it's not just about some PDF document map that we use. I can actually zoom in on the map and see the road and what it has bike lanes or not, and schools nearby, and show you how many crashes are there. That's why I want to advocate for us at least painting this, if not making it protected. And there's other tools you can go, and I think Mike's going to show more of these in terms of you can go and actually do click analysis, and you can analyze the density of crashes or injuries or deaths by different intersections. You can correlate that with equity measurements, demographics, schools, and things like that. And then you can finally share them out as a bunch of different applications. So if you want to go in and work with your local ANC rep or yell at your council member or advocate to DDOT, you can use that again with the same data they're using to make their decisions, so you can have a shared conversation. So I've mentioned a few here is that you can use open data. You can launch your own surveys if you want to. There's a tool called Survey 123. You can drag and drop and make your own surveys. This is a Vision Zero safety survey, where it isn't just crashes or collisions, but it's the feeling of safety. DC wants to have a low stress network. So they can reach out their surveys, but you can build your own survey and advocate to your own communities. I know in Capitol Hill, they're doing it around some of the senior living networks. You can do it around the school groups. You could do it around your garden clubs and things like that, and create these surveys and gather up data around your neighborhoods. You can then build maps with these. You can just put the dots in the map or the lines where people want to see bike lanes or better, safer crosswalks. But you can also pull in social demographic information, the US Census data, economic data, things like that would help you understand, are you even making an equitable recommendation, and then advocate that to the city. People that get really geeky on analysis, if you know Python or R, you can do notebooks to do deeper spatial analysis. And these are just a few examples, and we'll share the links afterwards. You can go and dive into these and play with the notebooks yourselves and build your own if you want to do some interesting spatial analysis. And again, what's cool is when you do this analysis, you're going to create maps and data that you can then share with other constituents, with the government, with other governments as well. It's all digital driven. And then you can build dashboards, apps, and even if you haven't played with this tool called Story Maps, you can actually make interactive, like New York Times level graphics with just a few clicks to really not just say, here's a bunch of data, but let me explain to you why this is so important and what to do about it. And everything's data driven. So as your survey results come in, as your maps update, the data that you provide, the government provides, even these story maps and these dashboards will all automatically update. And you might recognize some of these. This is if you look at any of the Johns Hopkins COVID dashboard, was built the same thing that you have access to as a resident or just someone interested in the region. You can create a free account and create these on your own. And then it's interesting as well for governments is that what we're helping do is you can bundle up all of these different tools into what we call templates that anybody then can deploy. So you're actually seeing we're seeing a lot of the governments in the region launch new Vision Zero sites by utilizing a template that was designed with about 20 or 30 cities around the country. They put it into a reusable template, kind of like if you open up Word, it says, oh, you're doing a newsletter or a birthday notice or a resume. It's the same thing here. Oh, you want to do Vision Zero? Well, we have a bunch of dashboards, surveys, and analyses that would jumpstart you on that path. You can set up for your region and share your message. And that works for a lot of even the advocacy and the planning ones. You could launch a Vision Zero program for your block if you wanted to, using these tools. So that's it for me. I just want to highlight that you can, there's a lot of amazing tools here, and that you can go with just Facebook or Google or an email or Apple, create an account and go and start creating these things on your own. And with that, I'm now going to hand off to Mike, who's going to show you some examples of things he's been working on to build advocacy over the last few years. So with that, I'll hand off to you, Mike.
Good. Andrew, thank you very much. That I just learned a lot of things with your presentation. I learned how many things we don't have on our side. So I'm going to do a share screen in a moment here. And so I'm part of a group called Northern Virginia Families for Safe Streets. And my day job, I'm an investment banker, and I had no knowledge or frankly interest in transportation safety other than just trying to navigate these roads and streets in a reasonable manner until about 7 years ago, when a driver of a SUV crashed into me while I was in the middle of a crosswalk. The driver was turning left. And after I got out of the hospital, I was considered severely injured, because I was. And it took me 3 years of neurological rehab. But at the time, I wanted to try to do something, felt very frustrated. And I wanted to try to do something to help other people prevent the type of thing that I've gone through, or worse yet, to end up losing a family member, being killed. So with some friends in Alexandria, Virginia, we started a chapter. We took the name Families for Safe Streets that had started in New York. And so we have now evolved to 3 chapters in Northern Virginia. So we have the creative name of Northern Virginia Families for Safe Streets. We're in Alexandria, Arlington, and Fairfax. We have about 1,600 people. That's quote members, anybody on our mailing list. And we do a lot of we're pedestrian focused, except in Arlington, we're also bike focused. We're really vulnerable road user, but in both Alexandria and Fairfax, there are robust volunteer groups on the biking side. So we stay in the pedestrian side. And we go out to the community, do education. We go into schools, do pet education at the schools. We go to farmers markets, etc. And one of the things we do as a tool in our advocacy is through the benefits and the skill set of ESRI. And we've had a benefit of a Virginia Tech Graduate School of Urban Planning studio class, as well as a grant from Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. So this has evolved. We started our near miss about 4 years ago. Today, if it means anything, some other organizations, including the WABA folks in DC, and then there's other people in San Francisco, et cetera, are starting to emulate this. We're happy to share what we've developed. We don't pretend it's the perfect one, but it's something. We're an all volunteer, not-for-profit, and our focus is on trying to promote safety on the streets. End of story. And we're very small. We're all volunteers, not a lot of money. But so what we have here is over time, this is the 3rd iteration of our near miss, and it's using the ESRI platform. And this is the when you come onto the landing page of the dashboard, you see different filters over on the side here. So you can filter this by type of behavior, the date, the time, the location, etc. And here are some just basic graphs of what bar charts and a pie chart. But the way that we really well, I like to use it, is to show, and it's very sensitive, so I'm going to try to be decent about this. So these red marks are the near miss reports, and a near miss close call. It's all anecdotal. It's all volunteer. The clusters are where you see a lot of reports. And sorry, give you. And I'm going on to Alexandria to Duke Street, which right now is a major discussion in the jurisdiction of Alexandria City, because there's an effort to try to put in center lane bus lanes and put in more effective, robust bike lanes and pedestrian lanes. And there is some controversy to that with the folks, particularly the folks in the neighborhoods. And they are feared that it's going to slow down traffic, and it's already a bad traffic. Our point is that there's a lot more residential construction happening on the west end of Duke Street. It's only going to get worse. And there have been a lot of crashes here, and a lot of unfortunately some fatalities. One of the things we can do in this type of analysis, we can show where I just clicked on the treads. So this is Virginia Department of Transportation. It's this is the killed or seriously injured KSIs of just pedestrians and cyclists. And it shows where fatalities have happened, or where there have been a serious injury. A serious injury, in the wisdom of the Virginia Department of Transportation, is anybody that is put in an ambulance and taken to the hospital, whether they have a few hours or whether they have years of rehab. Or some of our, unfortunately, some of our members are permanently crippled, and a few of them are cognitively impaired. One gentleman, a dad, is permanently crippled. He has a PhD. He's cognitively impaired permanently. He's an amazingly strong person, though, and his family's great. But so those black and the darker blacks and the blues, those represent pedestrians and cyclists who have been crashed into. And then on top is our near miss data. Any one of these points has a story behind it, so you can click on and see what that particular situation. In this case, it's they're reporting a cyclist and that they were walking, and the cyclist almost ran them over and almost hurt a senior citizen. As you can imagine, most of the reports are about drivers of vehicles that are driving 4,000 to 5,000 to 7,000 pounds, and it's speeding, failure to yield, etc. What do we do with this information? Well, one, we show this to people in the community and encourage them to help us gain reports. We have about, one of our challenges, we have about 2,000 data points, and we'd like to have 20,000 data points. So we have a long way to go. And the more data, the more effective it would be, and be able to do some of the true analytics, data analytics we'd like to do on this. You know, my dream is to be able to use this data to predict where future crash sites could be evolving, and hopefully encourage the transportation people and the policymakers to make changes to avoid those crashes. We use this today, for example, on this Duke Street, which is going to be voted on in a few weeks in the City Council of Alexandria. We sent them a letter. We articulated our points of view as to why it makes sense to redesign Duke Street from the 1960s to the 21st century, and to make it multimodal with center bus lanes, etc. And we used a screenshot of this Duke Street showing the number of near misses and the number of treads, KSIs for pedestrians and bicyclists. We have over 300 near misses on Duke Street of various types. And we have, unfortunately, over 25 KSIs on Duke Street. The KSIs are from 2016 to 2022. Our near miss really started in late 2018. So it's called 2019 through year to date 23. And we can use this in every jurisdiction. Where we find ourselves to have room for improvement is in regions where the folks are not likely to hear about it. Our big challenge is to educate people about it. So in Alexandria, the demographics, Old Town, this tends to be a wealthier, more expensive section. And as you go out to the West End, this is where a lot of apartments are and a lot of people in the underserved communities are located, as well as in another community called Orlandria. Same could be said in Fairfax, different corridors, and no surprise, where most of the crashes are happening tend to be where the underserved community members exist, and they travel on those roads. But that's part of our challenge. Part of our effort is to try to, at least we have this tool. Can it be improved? Yes, but we're trying to spread the word, have a crowdsourcing real-time venue that people can use to register their concerns. And then we take it. We're an all-volunteer group, so we're not shy about talking to the local authorities. We want to cooperate with them, and we'll ask them to make changes. And if they just say yes, but they don't really do anything, we'll go back to them and privately say what's going on, help explain why this isn't happening. And if they give a job, well, you know, it just takes a long time, we need more studies or blah, blah, blah. We'll go out and say, okay, fine, we disagree with what you're doing, the pace you're doing it. So we're gonna go public, and our intent is to shame you into getting action done. And don't take it personally. You know, some of us have put blood on the street. We're just trying to get things safer, period. And but for the most part, all the municipalities that we're dealing with are very responsive. We have a good relationship with them. VDOT, being the state agency, they're trying, but there's an awful lot that can be done. And unfortunately, too many people are being killed on streets, roads controlled by VDOT. But that's what we do. That's how we try to do it. And from there, Andrew, I give it back to you. I'll stop sharing, and we can go to the next session.
Great, thanks. I really appreciate that, Mike. Thank you very much for sharing that. So we'll hand it off. I'll hand it off now to Trisalyn, who's going to share her expertise and her research in this area, and then we'll have some time after that for some discussion. So off to you, Trisalyn.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just going to set up here 1 sec. Yeah, so I'm super. Is that working okay?
Yep.
Okay.
We're seeing the presenter mode.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I'm super excited to be here today to talk with all of you about some of the work that we've been doing. So I'm a GIS professor, but I'm also someone who just feels happier when I'm on my bike. And a few years ago, well, in about 2014, I decided to put those two things together, my love of maps and my love of biking. And it has led to sort of a line of research that really is focused around how do we create better data and also better information for decision makers aiming to support biking and walking policy. So I'm going to mostly talk about the bike work, but I'll put a few shout outs to the pedestrian work we're doing as well. So it's not surprising to anyone here that the dominant mode of transportation in our cities is the vehicle. And that is partly because we've invested a lot of money and time and energy into making cities drivable. And I'd say the same thing is true about our data assets. So if it's very common for cities to have good data on on vehicle volume, for example, but on bike volume or pedestrian volume, these data sets can be very hard to come by. So we're really trying to fill that gap. And there's 3 areas where we've done a fair amount of work. I'm not going to talk too much about infrastructure today, but I'd be happy to answer questions about it. I'm a huge advocate of everybody using OpenStreetMap, which is an open data source for infrastructure mapping. But I will talk more about safety and accessibility data as well as bike volume data. So these are 2 areas we've worked on a lot. But I think, these are 3 sort of groups of data that are really important for us to think about if we want to make good decisions about how we're designing our cities. So understanding that there's a gap in the reporting of bike crashes, we developed a website called bikemaps.org. So it's estimated that only about 20 to 30% of bike crashes are officially reported. And we tend to lack near-miss data unless you're lucky enough to work with Mike Doyle in Virginia, where you have some near-miss data, which is wonderful to see. But in response to this sort of underreporting, we've launched a website called bikemaps.org, and it works globally. So you can use it in DC. There is some data already in DC. And anyone can report a bike crash, a near miss, or report a hazard. And Bike Maps is available in English, French, Spanish, German, and Icelandic, because we had an Icelandic partner. And it will soon be available in Finnish because we have a group in Helsinki that is going to start to partner with us. But this is a great way to start to collect data to better understand some of the safety issues that Mike was talking about, really. And the way it works is, you feel like you're on something like Google Maps. You have to scroll around and identify a location where you've had an incident or seen an incident. And then we ask you to fill in. You drop a pin, and then this form pops up. And you can give us a bunch of information about what happened and what the injury was. And we ask demographic information so we can understand who's reporting and how some of the outcomes vary by age and gender. One of the most useful components of the Bike Maps platform is that we do allow narrative data as well, so people can fill in descriptions about what happened. And we find when we go to analyze these data that this is amongst the most useful data, because it really allows you to understand not just that there was an incident there, but also what it was, which can help with the interventions. And then we also have this visualization page where you can look at how reports are coming in over time, how many collisions or near misses you have. We do see this day of the week trend. So midweek tends to be when you have the highest number of incidents occurring. And this is probably because a lot of the users of Bike Maps are commuters, or at least pre-pandemic, that was the case. But it's also because these are the busiest times of the week for road traffic. And so we can look at things over time. One of my favorite things about Bike Maps is so often when you have data from an official source, like in California, this is collected by police and uploaded into a system called SWITTERS, which is managed by the Department of Transportation. And in that data, you don't have injury outcomes. But with Bike Maps, we do ask people some limited questions, but about their injury. And so you can see here, this is some data for Victoria, Canada, where I was living when we launched Bike Maps. That's where I'm from. And you can see this is a 24-hour clock basically along the x-axis, and then the y-axis is the relative proportion. So you have the blue is a near miss or no injury, green required a doctor's visit, and red required a hospital. And the gray line is an eco counter. So this is some measure of the total number of bicyclists that were but just at one location, but it does give us some sense about how much volume there are at different times of the day. And you can see, the morning peak is when you're getting the highest proportion of people who have incidents that require a doctor or hospital. So I think it's interesting how we can utilize some of these crowdsourced tools to get a deeper understanding of what some people are experiencing. This is the most common kind of map that people ask us to make. So when we have a city partner, we will often, do outreach to get community members and bicyclists mapping incidents that occurred for them. And then we'll take all the official data and we'll combine it with the bike maps data. And we'll use Esri's kernel density estimator function in their spatial analyst tool to make these hotspot maps or locations of sort of most problematic locations for bicycling. And so you can see all of our little circles there, identify areas where infrastructure investments or other kinds of activities could be really helpful and give them some indication about what the issues are in those locations. The reason actually that we started bike maps, or that I started bike maps, was because, I'm a GIS professor. So I'm basically a data scientist that likes maps. And I really wanted this data so I could do analysis. And it took us a while to get to the volume of data that we needed to do robust analysis. But now we're starting to really be able to understand new things about what people are reporting. And one of the interesting things is, if you look across North America at all of the reports that have been made, some of the most common report is the right hook. So this is when you pull up to an intersection and you have a bike and a car side by side, and the car is going to go right, but the bike is going to go straight. And then it's a right hook and the bicyclist gets hit. And so I kind of appreciate that is the most common report, because that is something that's quite easy to solve. So you can just, instead of having bikes and cars pull side by side, if you put the bikes in front of the cars, then that stops that issue from happening. And that's a pretty cheap infrastructure fix. So that's just like one example. So these are the top 5 kind of incidents that are being reported sort of North America wide. We also kind of city by city have been looking at, once you get enough data in a city, then you can start to figure out what are some of the predictors of injury. And I think this is a study we did for Victoria, British Columbia, where we were looking at, okay, what are the predictors that an incident will lead to the need for medical treatment? And there are some specific things to Victoria here. They have an urban deer problem. And so during dawn and dusk, the deer cause a lot of trouble for bicyclists. And you can see this is one of the top kinds of incidents that lead to pretty severe outcomes for people. But I think it's interesting when Mike was sharing his personal experience, another one that we see consistently across North America is when motor vehicles are making a left-hand turn. This is very dangerous and does lead to more problematic outcomes for people on bikes. So yeah, I think that this is the kind of information you could get for your own city if you are interested in kind of conducting the outreach needed to get people mapping. I'm not going to talk too much about it here, but ever since we launched bike maps, people have asked us for a pedestrian version. And about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, we launched Walk Roll Map, which is really focused on pedestrians and folks in wheelchairs or other mobility assisting devices. And it's got safety information in it, but more than safety information, it's really focused on accessibility. So what are the barriers to being able to walk or roll to the places that you want to go to? And the outreach for this has been quite different, but this is available in French and English if folks are interested in using it as well. So these are really available tools that we love to see different cities pick up. So that's sort of the safety data I'm going to talk about. The second part of my presentation is going to talk a little bit about ridership and volume estimates. So we can understand that if I'm an urban planner trying to make good decisions about my city, knowing which corridors have lots of riders and few riders is helpful. Being able to monitor that over time is helpful. And the reason I got into bike volume mapping is because I wanted to be able to differentiate between these two scenarios. So here you have one bicyclist, and on the other side you have lots of bicyclists. And if you had one bike crash in both of these locations, the proportion of people exposed to biking that had an injury would be quite different. And so just like with COVID, how, we have count data, but it was actually often more helpful to look at COVID data with the denominator, which is the total number of people who lived in that area, who could have been exposed. I mean, those were more useful metrics. And for bike safety research, it's the same thing. We're always trying to get at exposure. And so the typical ways, as I'm sure many of you know, that we collect data are many cities have volunteer count programs where a few times a year at many locations, volunteers will go out and count the number of bikes that go by. I think it is really important work when we engage in this, but I also do find it a bit frustrating because no city would suggest that we needed to have a volunteer vehicle count program. So, but that's the legit way that we collect data. And then the other common way is to use eco counters or some kind of counter. So here I'm showing a permanent eco counter that when I was at Arizona State University, we had installed there, but these can also be temporary counters. So the volunteer count programs are great because you can get lots of locations, so good spatial coverage, whereas the permanent counters are great because you can have good temporal coverage. But another data set that we've been interested in working with for quite a while is Strava data. So Strava is primarily it's used by recreational riders or fitness riders who are tracking their activities. And so the good thing about Strava is that there's a huge amount of data. So, and it's growing all the time. So this is just some data we had for Phoenix in 2016. And in the year of 2016, there were 44 billion records of bike ridership. So all across the city, every 15 minutes, for every street segment, every single day, whether people wanted that data collected or not, we have data, or whether they knew they needed it or not, I think is the more important point. There's a measure of how many people were out riding Strava. And this would compare to the official count program that happened in that same year where 42 locations had 1 week of measurement. So there's just a lot more data. But it's problematic to use Strava data because it tends to be biased towards, it's not representative of everyone. It's representative of people who are fitness riders, which tend to be more men, tend to be more people sort of middle-aged, tend to be people of higher incomes, tend to be people who already have a lot of access to bicycling. But I just couldn't let go of the fact that there was so much resolution that we really wanted and we couldn't get another way. So our team has gone about thinking, how can we use the data in Strava to model ridership of everyone? And so here's just one example from the city of Ottawa, where we looked at an eco counter. So this is a permanent counter. And so that's along the y-axis, and the Strava activity is along the x-axis. And we looked at the relationship of those things. So we know Strava undercounts, but could we model by how much? And here you can see there's a pretty linear relationship. The different colors represent different seasons because Ottawa is very seasonal. In Santa Barbara, we probably wouldn't be too interested in seasons. But regardless of the season, there's a pretty strong relationship. So in this particular location, one Strava rider actually represents 37 total riders. So you could uplift the sample at that location. And it turns out that how much undersampling or undercounting Strava does varies based on your geographic location. So this is the perfect thing to use GIS for. So in some locations where you have, lots of hills and beautiful scenery, almost everyone out there climbing those hills is a Strava rider. And so it's a pretty close to a one-to-one relationship. But in a quiet residential street where there's lots of people just trying to get their kids to school on bikes, Strava is going to really underestimate the total number of riders. And so we can use our understanding of geography with training data to basically make machine learning models that predict the total number of riders based on Strava and a couple other variables. So we've done this for 5 cities across North America. And we have found that using Strava counts of ridership as well as bicycle safety data, so it would be like the data Mike was showing or like data from bike maps and income data, we can get pretty accurate estimates of the average number of riders on an annual basis. So this is an example of how we've represented that data for the city of Tempe. And if you use the data categorically, so from sort of very high to very low ridership, this becomes a pretty reasonable map of ridership in a city. And because we lack this kind of data, I think this is a huge benefit for trying to understand safety as well as other kinds of planning. So this is just because I think the most important thing is understanding error. So this shows that how accurate the models are in these different cities. And actually what I think is important to understand is that the biggest thing that impacts how accurate you can model this is how representative the data that you use to train the model are. So in all these cities, we had lots of locations where we had total number of bikes counted, and we used that to build these models. But in cities where that data was collected by the regional government, it meant that they had a wider variety of conditions where they had measured bicycling, and we were able to create more accurate models for them. So we can talk more about that if you're interested. This is an interesting example of how we've combined the safety data that I showed initially with the ridership data. So here is in A, we can show locations where we've made hotspot maps of unsafe bicycling. And so these are locations, actually turns out, where you have lots of biking activity. Panel B shows the Strava data. So this is a measure of ridership. And panel C shows a measure of, it's the ratio of both. So here we've looked at ridership or crashes divided by ridership. And while in A, the hotspots represent locations where you have lots of bicycling, in panel C, you're now representing locations where, based on the number of people riding there, the amount of injury or crashes are higher than you would like. And these are probably areas where infrastructure investments would give you a great bang for your buck. So what's next? So I love that Mike showed us a dashboard, because what's next for us is that we're really thinking about how to integrate all of these things into an Esri-powered dashboard. So we have ways of mapping bike infrastructure, and then we're looking at accessibility and safety data, the ridership data, and then also equity data, so that we can hand decision makers and the public and advocates tools that are where all this data is put together in a powerful way to help improve decision making. So just a shout out to the wonderful people. We've been doing this since 2014, and this is the current iteration of the team, but so many wonderful people have helped with this work. And thanks.
Awesome, Trisalyn. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's definitely, I have a couple, between you and Mike, have definitely a couple of points to talk about. By the way, I will say, one of the great quotes you said was, and I think it's worth, I'll say it out again, we wouldn't expect a city to crowdsource its vehicle counts. So that's why I think the work that you're doing and the work that Mike's doing in communities like that are so remarkable, because it's something that we should be doing in cities, and we're not yet. So I think hopefully conversations like this and WABA hosting a summit like this will get us and governments thinking about how to do that more systematically. I want to give a chance if anyone in the audience wants to ask any questions before I have my own slate of things. Looks like there's a Q&A. I see the Q&A section over here. Great. Yeah, so first I'll read it out, is that Seth from WABA asks, there are very few bike map incidents mapped for the Washington, D.C. area. So this is a regionally focused summit, although again, as you've highlighted, it's something that's affecting communities all around the country and the world. But he said, what areas have a volume report sufficient to support analyses? And do you have an estimate for the proportion of incidents that you capture in an area?
Yeah, so, I usually, this is just sort of my gut from having worked on this for many years, is once you have about 200 incidents reported on bike maps, you can start to make useful hotspot maps. So I would say, doing that level of outreach is probably pretty important. And then, in order to build predictive models of what's predicting injury, I would say you probably want more like 800 points in your region. And these are just rough estimates depending on, how the size. But I would say for Washington, that would be probably a good estimate. We have loads of outreach tools. So, we've worked with lots of cities. We have lots of templates for postering, for having stickers printed, for a variety of things. And and some of it's social media outreach, some of it's getting a story in the newspaper. This is, hey, our group is partnering with bikemaps.org, report your data here. Some of it is like the important work of tabling events and showing up at some of your bike events to get people mapping. So I don't really have a percentage of riders that are reached or anything like that. But I will say, for the city of Victoria, where I launched this, at the time, their official data was reporting around 120 bike crashes a year. And so if you are getting, 300 additional reports, that's actually a huge amount of additional data that they can utilize. So I think having a sense about what the official data is providing and knowing that that's, usually on the order of 20 to 30% of what's happening might give you some targets.
Yep. Yeah. And Seth had one, a follow-up one, and then I'll go to another question and pull you and Mike in a moment. Is he said, you're just saying, it'd be interesting to correlate crowdsourced incidents with official data records, right? And I'll highlight that. Yeah, that's obviously what you're doing in bikemaps.org. That's what, Seth, you can go start clicking around right now and start doing that. You could grab Mike's data, just to be clear, and this is, we don't have time here to go and kind of the GIS behind the scenes, but Mike's dashboard that you could copy his and create your own behind the scenes has an API for his data. You could pull his data with census data that's available in the same API and start doing these correlations yourself right away, just pure clicks, so no coding. But if you wanted to, you could go coding if you wanted to. So the answer to that is yes. And I think I'm hoping that, be interesting. There are a lot of these what are called civic tech brigades, code for DC, code for Maryland, code for Virginia, and other ones like that, that I think there's a lot of people who are day jobs are doing these kinds of data science and analysis for agencies and companies in their spare time. They're like Mike's volunteering to create these dashboards and tools. They're doing data analysis and app development as well. So I think that'd be an interesting synergy to have here as well. So go ahead.
We've written some papers on this as well, where we look at sort of what are the different patterns from the different data sources. What do they tell us? And I think a key thing that we find is that official data show you lots of incidents where there's lots of vehicles, because so much of that is biased towards where vehicles are involved. Whereas the crowdsourced data show you where there's lots of bicycles. So like rails to trails type situations, where the trail crosses a road network, those kind of things show up more on the bike maps data.
Yeah. So I'm curious about, and maybe this is something we would have follow up with, but thinking about, Mike, the work you're doing, which is fascinating because Trisalyn mentioned OpenStreetMap, right? So I'll use a parallel to pull this in. It is a global crowdsourced map database, but what makes it successful are local communities working together and holding mapping parties to gather the data and put into a common system. And I'm thinking with what you're doing, Mike, in terms of working with local groups to crowdsource this data, a lot of data, right? More than is currently in bike maps, but that data could feed in to bike maps, right? And there could be a source of like where you have a community like yours, and we do ones in DC and elsewhere. I'm curious what each of Mike, your thoughts on that, about this data flowing into a system like that, and then Trisalyn, your thoughts on how that might work to crowdsource hyperlocal data like that.
Well, I'll go first. So our data, I would guess that probably 30–40% of our data are bikers reporting incidences, near miss incidences. And in Arlington, they're the majority of the reports. But in all the other communities, yes. And for that matter, we do get near miss reports in DC, and it can go any place. We can get a near miss report in Victoria, Canada. We're just not going to do anything with it. we're struggling with a bunch of little volunteers. But yes, we can do that. Our challenge, as I said before, is to go to the communities that are highest risk and try to get them to participate. So we have our near miss data. We hand out cards, our dashboard on the survey. I didn't bother to show that, but the survey where people put in the anecdotal as well as the specifics of a crash, of a near miss. It can be in Spanish, and it can be in almost any language. It's thanks to Google translation, but we did a lot of work on Spanish, and Arabic. So we're trying to figure out techniques to get us into these communities that, and some of them, they don't trust having to do a survey. And we say, you don't have to put your name. You don't have to, you just put the data in. But the way that we've have achieved a little bit of success is going directly, meet the people, and have colleagues who are multilingual to help us convey the messaging. But that's hugely time consuming. And I wish we could figure out other ways of doing it. But anyway, that's where we are.
That's great. I say that's where it's, I think Trisalyn was mentioning as well, the importance of inclusivity. And we heard earlier in some of the other panels today about that, making sure, and you think about digital divide, you think about making sure representation, equity, right? That work of going and building trust.
Yeah, big time.
Local languages, having someone talk to them, maybe even having someone just fill out the form with them as they're doing it. That's how the U.S. Census does it too, right? They literally work with local churches and community groups to do the door-to-door trust building and quote data gathering. Just I'm curious on your part, like that concept or potential around how you might have bikemaps.org as kind of a global aggregator of hyperlocal community generated data.
Yeah, I think it is a great idea. I think whenever you go to do work in a particular jurisdiction, you are trying to scrape together all the data. And the beauty of GIS is that, we can use location as a universal indexing tool for doing that. So yes, I think we definitely want to do that. The logistical tricky part is that each of these data sets has different attributes collected. And so then the tricky part is to stick it all into one sort of seamless thing. How do you integrate all those different variables? But, in terms of like whether or not it's all on bike maps, I think having these things all point to each other so that when a city is trying to make, when someone's trying to do analysis, they can scrape it all together. I think we do need these sort of synthesis tools.
Yeah, that's a good point. And maybe it's, go ahead, Mike.
So just quickly, one of the things in our survey that as we try to develop it, we took a look at what the police reports have. So we could try to do some type of from the TREDS, which is the Department of Transportation, Virginia, what the police are reporting. Not that some of the police reports, they miss a lot of things, but our hope is to be able to do correlations between the data sets that we have and the crash data that the TREDS have through the police reports. We've also made some suggestions about how they can improve their reporting, which didn't go over too well, but we did that.
Imagine. That's great. Well, I'm going to create a call here on the record for WABA. I think WABA, as the organizer of this summit, has a potentially really interesting role to help people that we've heard from a few others that said, hey, I'd love to do this, but I don't have GIS expertise. I'm saying there's people like myself and others in these communities who could volunteer and do what Mike's done, but not make Mike do all of it. Maybe WABA can help organize these as like focused workshops, getting communities together, build these things, work with Trisalyn in terms of, okay, if you want to start with a survey, start with these questions because they could flow in and they're common based on what Mike's done and what would flow into bike maps. And that can be something really interesting, actually really build a community here of experts and community members who would want to take this and scale it out across the region, and then maybe as a model for scaling it across the country and the world. Anyway, I want to wrap up. Thank you again very much, Mike, for sharing all your work, and Trisalyn for all your research and your work as well. I'm super excited to follow up and see what we can do together. Peter, I'll hand it back to you. You're muted.
This was incredibly informative, and I hope any of you all three who are willing to put your contact information in the chat, please do. I hope that Charlie Grimes got his question addressed in some way or is able to connect with people. But this is, we could spend hours talking about this stuff, even for those of us that are not total data nerds. And we really appreciate your showing us these tools. And I hope that we can continue this discussion, between WABA and NOVA, Families for Safe Streets, and Trisalyn and Andrew. So thank you very much, everybody. And I